Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, what can the world learn from the Far East? The pandemic began in East Asia, but governments there, from China to South Korea to Japan to Taiwan and Singapore, have been credited with coping far more effectively with the pandemic than some of their counterparts in the West. Death tolls in Asia have been considerably lower thanks to, we're told, aggressive state responses, higher levels of testing, intrusive tracking, and stricter quarantines. Some have even managed to avoid shutting down their economies too. So, are there lessons to be learned by the rest of the world? And not just in coping with future disease outbreaks, but in how we fundamentally order our societies? I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzy Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph. We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please hit like, share and subscribe. Joining us today is Ha-Joon Chang, a development economist at Cambridge University and the best-selling author of 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, among other extremely widely read books. Ha-Joon, welcome to CoronaNomics.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's start by looking at a chart put together with information from Our World in Data, showing the total number of COVID-19 deaths in different countries around the world. It shows a significantly higher death toll in Western countries, such as the US, UK, France, Spain and Italy, than in Asian countries like China, Singapore, Japan and Korea. It's almost a tale of two pandemics. We frequently hear that one of the reasons that Asia has coped relatively well with the pandemic, Ha-Joon, is cultural. So, for instance, the strong culture of public hygiene in Japan, the tendency for people to favour bowing over handshaking, the culture of mask wearing in places like Hong Kong when you're ill, etc. Now, you've been critical of the tendency to overemphasise cultural explanations for differences between nations' historic economic performance. We were wondering what you made of these latest cultural explanations for how countries have performed in the pandemic.
Yes, I think there has been a degree of kind of cultural prejudice, and in some circles, even degree of racism about the way East Asian countries have dealt with this. People following guidelines strictly and so on have been crucial. Yeah, you could say that there was more of that in East Asia, but let's not forget that these obeyance of collective order is not cultural. I mean, if you go back in history and read materials written by Westerners visiting Asia, China, Japan, Korea, they all say these people are wild. I mean, they don't follow order. I mean, they are individualistic. They have no discipline. This so-called culture of discipline was something that has been constructed. It's not something that has been there since the beginning of time. But more importantly, even in modern times where these countries became more organized and disciplined, the governments have had to earn this trust of the general public, not just take it for granted. Of course, there are some periods in some countries where violent repression made people obedient. But let's take my native country, South Korea, which I know the best. It's a country which is known for citizen disobedience. The country has kicked out like 3 governments through the political protests. Let's look at it this way. I mean, these test, control, and isolate measures, some of them, especially in the non-democratic China, might have looked rather oppressive, but as a result, for example, South Korea is the freest country at the moment. We have no spectators, but we have baseball, professional baseball league. We have a professional football league. Everything is open except for schools and clubs. So, by sacrificing a little bit of freedom in the beginning, we have achieved actually greater freedom.
Is it unhelpful to even talk about an Asian response, in the way people are implying that South Korea is similar to Japan, is similar to China, etc.? Does that actually get us anywhere?
No, it doesn't. I mean, as I just mentioned, there are Western countries, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, which recognized the seriousness of the problem and intervened very early, and in a very similar way, Germans have been testing and tracing in a very aggressive way. There is no West-East divide. I mean, it's that a divide between failed policies and more successful policies.
Well, different countries have used different approaches to controlling the spread of the virus. For instance, here's a robot dog being used in Singapore to enforce 2-meter social distancing in public places. You mentioned a moment ago the current political norms and institutions in certain Asian countries are better suited to the kinds of technologies and state surveillance methods that may help us cope better with the virus until we have a vaccine. And the mobile phone apps that track people's location and mandatory quarantines are actually maybe less objectionable in places like Hong Kong and China and Singapore that traditionally place less emphasis on personal privacy and liberty. So what's your view on that?
The so-called freedom that we are talking about, the people moving about, it is indirectly killing people. Do we have freedom to kill other people? I really object to that formulation. I mean, it's not your own formulation, but I think we need to just drop this fictitious divide between freedom-loving West and the East. That is not like that. I mean, as I keep saying, many Western countries have done basically what East Asian countries have done, and also in countries like Korea, this tracing and so on have been done in a very sensitive way. I mean, your individual privacy is completely protected, and citizens believe that the government is not going to abuse this data, because this government has been put in power only because people protested against the intrusive government that abused this power. So I think that it's basically how the citizens work, how they are organized, that really has made a difference.
So, Ha-Joon, let's talk a little bit about deglobalization, a very big, important topic. We're going to look at a map from Bloomberg Economics, which shows just how important China is in industrial supply chains. So the darker green the colour of the country in this map, the more important China is in the supply of intermediate products to that country. So that's things like machinery and microchips. In the US, for example, it's providing more than 35% of the supply of those intermediate products. Now, many people are arguing that one of the economic legacies of this crisis will be the reshoring of Western industrial production, not only from China, but Asia more broadly, especially for things such as medical equipment. How concerned are you, Ha-Joon, about the potential impact of that aspect of deglobalization on lower income Asian countries that might have been expected to benefit from Western manufacturing investment?
Yes, I think that some sectors like medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, they might see some reshoring, but I don't think there'll be a major reshoring of manufacturing activities, because the reason why they have been offshored, I mean, is because the production conditions in the places where these factories are run give much more efficiency to the firm. And of course, with this crisis, we have realized that we need to build more resilience in, so that there might be some marginal adjustment, but I just cannot imagine that you can uproot the entire electronics manufacturing sector from Asia and begin to build iPhones in California. I don't think you can take back car factories from Mexico and Brazil and begin to build cars in Detroit again, because the conditions are not there. I mean, you can do it, but it will be extremely costly, because then you'll have to rebuild the whole infrastructure, retrain all the workers, create all these industrial tissues, as some economists call it. All this supply chain, the specialized firms doing technical consulting, the design firms and so on, and it will be extremely time-consuming and costly. And also, I think I differ with most people in believing that actually trade of physical goods can actually increase as a result of this crisis. not in necessarily in absolute terms, because we will experience recession and economic shrinkage, but in relative terms, the importance of goods trade will actually increase. First of all, a lot of sectors that are the most badly hit are services, because it involves that human interaction, face-to-face, provision of services. So what are the main businesses that have been shut? Tourism, hospitality, theaters, sporting events, and so on. So in relative terms, that these sectors are, at least in the foreseeable future, when the whole world is vaccinated, these sectors are going to shrink. And what are people going to do with the money that are not spent on these things anymore? I mean, they'll buy more things. Already there are signs that the sales of electronics equipment is rising. People might, I don't know, I mean, that have been saving up to go and see Machu Picchu in Peru, and they suddenly realize that there's no prospect of going there in the next 5 years, and then they may decide to buy the latest LG display so that they can at least see the place in more vivid image. So paradoxically, I think globalization will change its shape, but I don't think it's going to take a retreat in the way that most people imagine.
But even before this crisis, we had the Trump administration, for example, threatening to decouple America from the Chinese economy. Are they just empty threats, do you think? Is it actually impossible to separate America from China and actually reverse globalization?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, if he were president in, I don't know, 1995, maybe he could have done it, but not anymore, The two economies are so intricately linked with each other. It's not going to be possible to ship all the manufacturing back to U.S. or ship it all to other countries. That they have American firms, the Korean firms, German firms. They have built all these supply networks in China over decades. They have the skilled workers, they have the research facilities, they have the production linkages, and you cannot just will it away. Sure, there'll be some marginal adjustment, but I don't think that the whole trend being completely reversed, as some people are saying.
Ha-Joon, a lot of people on the left in the West regard globalization as a bad thing, or at least a negative thing in many respects. Whereas the argument from development economists, a lot of development economists, is that it's a good thing because it's helped pull people out of poverty in China and in other countries in Asia. Just wondering what your overall view is on the impact of globalization on Asia.
Yeah, no, Asia has benefited the most by the globalization process. Yes, I mean, a lot of the industries have moved out of the US and the UK, but Germany is still very industrialized. Austria is very industrialized. Sweden is, Finland is. Depending on the policies that different countries pursue, they can actually produce very different results. I mean, the German firms have benefited hugely through globalization because now they are supplying, Korea with highly advanced machines, which then export the intermediate inputs to China. The fact that some countries have benefited more than others and in different ways is basically the proof that what you do as a government, what you do as a society, makes a big difference in the harnessing the powers of globalization. It's not a necessarily good thing or a bad thing. It all depends on how you cope with it and how you share the burdens of adjustment. That is a disruptive process, positively and negatively. And some countries have decided to dump all the adjustment costs on the certain sections of society, like manual workers in the manufacturing sector, whereas others have shared it out more equally by keeping some of these manufacturing industries at home, by having better welfare provision, by investing more in education and research so that your workers are more skilled and therefore better paid. So I think it's all to do with how you deal with these forces, because the forces themselves are rather abstract. I mean, there's no one great old world government that is organizing this process. So it's
So,
really up to countries to make what they can out of this.
so which countries do you think will emerge best out of the crisis?
Oh, I think countries have all seen the weaker side of their society and economy through this crisis. Even relatively successful countries like South Korea, it probably has managed the health crisis the best in the world, but the process has exposed the weaknesses of its social safety net, especially self-employed people. The country has a very high rate of self-employed people, 25% of the workforce. The OECD average is about 12. The US is not even 7%. And yeah, throughout this process, even though we didn't have a full lockdown, I mean, the businesses were very low for many of these people who were, essentially eking out marginal existence by, I don't know, selling fried chicken, running small karaoke bars. These are the people that you have seen in the Oscar-winning Korean movie, The Parasite. You run a chicken shop and you go bankrupt, and you do another venture and then you go bankrupt again, and you end up in semi-basement apartment with not even the internet signal. These people have suffered greatly throughout this process, and the country, which has been quite averse to the idea of welfare state so far, is now finally talking about universal employment insurance.
So, if we can talk about some of those more radical policy measures that you mentioned, South Korea's Gyeonggi province, the most populous in the country, has introduced a disaster basic income along with other local governments. You've previously said that one of the UK's main difficulties in dealing with the crisis has been that despite it having a national health service, it's chronically underfunded. So, in your view, would it be more responsible to spend the money on better public services instead of giving it directly to people as helicopter money?
That's right. Yeah. No, actually, paradoxically, countries that have given this the disaster basic income or helicopter money, actually countries that have a weak welfare state, like the U.S., South Korea, the countries that whose basic the welfare system cannot reach everyone. They didn't have to do it in countries like Denmark. Countries like Finland. So I think actually this idea of basic income exposes the weakness of welfare system in certain countries. The thing about basic income is that it's only looking at one side. It's looking at the income. Do people have money to buy social protection? I think what is as important is the supply side. Are these services affordable? If you have privatized welfare provision that has a lot of the markups and so on, then these services will become very expensive. I mean, the US is a great example. I mean, the country spends 17% of GDP on healthcare, basically the one and a half times twice those of other advanced countries in proportional terms, and has the worst health record in the rich world. Why? Because their medical services are extremely expensive.
Ha-Joon, I want to ask you about two particular countries, Taiwan and Singapore, because they're often held up in the West by people on the right as sort of examples of where the UK should be going, because they have a relatively low share of taxation. They seem to be relatively efficient governments. Is there any? What would be your take on that? Sort of view of countries' success in Asia?
Yeah, unfortunately, these people don't know what they are talking about. If you want to become like Singapore, you have to accept that 90% of the land is owned by the government. 85% of housing is provided by the government. And a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines. I mean, is the UK government willing to nationalize 90% of the land, nationalize the companies that produce nearly 1/4 of the GDP? No. I mean, the people are just picking things that they like. Yes, I mean, the country has free trade, the country welcomes foreign investors, the country has low tax, but it can actually have low tax because the government is the largest landlord, and a lot of government revenue coming through the rent that it gets from the private sector. The government has a huge the revenue stream in these state-owned enterprises. If you want to become like Singapore, become truly like Singapore, you cannot just pick elements that you like and completely ignore the other elements, which might go completely against your view. I mean, Taiwan's not as extreme as Singapore, but it's also got a huge public sector. You know, state-owned enterprises in Taiwan collectively produce something like 16% of GDP. I mean, however, the taxes are not as high, not as low as in Singapore. You know, even Hong Kong, you know, all the land is owned by the government. So, you know, when you want to learn from some model, you really need to understand it as a whole. You know, when you actually look at successful countries, they often use combinations of policies and institutions that are not prescribed by any particular ideological position, you know.
It's been a brilliant conversation, and I think what we've learned is that
Thank you.
it's a lot more complicated than Asia versus the rest. There is no single Asian model. There's lots of different policies and different countries working in different ways. So I'm really glad we brought that out. So thank you so much to our guest, Ha-Joon Chang, for appearing on this episode of CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how to weather the economic storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like and subscribe.
And if you'd like to talk to us, just leave us a comment below.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.